Occupied Europe, 1941. Thrown into the cold cell, there is a stained grate in the floor, hooks above the ceiling, a table of whips and bludgeons, and live electrical wires off the wall. You're in the hands of the Gestapo, and the Gestapo are above the law. From 1933 to 1945, the Gestapo was a not-so-secret police force that brought terror and harm to any it considered an enemy. Come along for an exploration of all things underground and secret as we investigate the workings of occupied Europe's most feared outfit. From plain-clothed agents to hidden punishment chambers, from public snitching to overruling the courts, the Gestapo held a fearful grip over much of Europe across World War II, and people were right to be scared. Prepare to be shocked and disturbed as we uncover one of the Holocaust's most potent players and surveillance operators that will live forever in infamy. The secret state police of Nazi Germany, known as the Gestapo, was an insidious internal force of the Third Reich at its height during World War II. Established by Hermann Goering in 1933, it was run under the auspices of Heinrich Himmler. The function of the Gestapo was to weed out and eliminate any political opponents of the Nazi regime through investigation and interrogation. It would gain an infamous reputation for repression and brutal tactics against anyone who resisted the Nazi regime. While targeting political opponents, the Gestapo would also persecute homosexuals, communists, socialists, Jews, and many others labeled enemies of the Nazi administration. So who was it that actually worked for this clandestine operation? In the majority, Gestapo officers were professionally trained individuals, usually with a history of having worked as policemen or detectives under the Weimar Republic. Its head, Heinrich Müller, for example, had served as a policeman in Munich since 1919. The idea was that skill, knowledge, and experience brought by previous police officers were invaluable to the Gestapo's extrajudicial activities. To top this off, the Gestapo were typically dressed in plain clothes. That's not to say all agents of the Gestapo were one-time policemen. Many were recruited through the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD. That's the intelligence agency branch of the fearsome SS. These individuals had either very little or entirely no police training to speak of. What SD recruits did have was an avid following of the Nazi ideology and regime. This was an intentional move on behalf of Himmler to take a system of policing with its judicial provisos and laws and turn it into an ideological arm of the Nazi machine. In practice, the Gestapo was a terrifying blend of police experience and Nazi ideological zeal. The Gestapo conducted their ideological mission in an immoderate fashion. It was policing plus police methodology on the surface with absolutely no bounds of law. In a threefold simplification, they sought denunciations from the members of the public upon their fellow citizens. They would carry out searches on persons and premises without permission or warrant. Then, they would conduct infamous interrogations. Once again, with no law to bind their actions, the very lives of the people interrogated lay in the hands of the brutal Gestapo agents. Arguably, the most societally damaged aspect of the Gestapo was its reliance on denunciations. Receiving tips from the public was an unquestioned gateway to Gestapo activity. Should a tip be received on a colleague, neighbor, acquaintance, or even a friend or family member, the Gestapo had all they need to conduct searches or interrogations. Just the suspicion of illegal or suspicious activity could land a person in a situation beyond the law and at risk of death. So often, denunciations were made by those seeking personal gain, wrapped up in politics or ideology. The cost for the person denounced would be their life. It wasn't uncommon for a Gestapo investigation to lead to houses, workplaces, and apartments being surveilled and searched by agents. The Gestapo were limitless and required no warrant to listen in on telephone conversations, or read a person's mail, or even enter their home. Nazi Germany was a sandbox for the Gestapo to flex their unbridled power. Interestingly, the Gestapo was not a huge bureaucracy. It didn't have a tremendous amount of personnel. The Gestapo was successful in its mythos. People lived in fear of Gestapo surveillance, even when it was highly unlikely. The Gestapo never conducted mass surveillance on the German population, but they did make the lives of many terrifying ordeal. Ironically, thanks to the denunciations from the German public. An exception to the legal system in place, the Gestapo activities were riddled with arbitrariness and secrecy. Anyone who faced arrest or interrogation by the Gestapo were robbed of civil protections and rights. Extreme physical punishment and killing outside of the law were far from uncommon. What was perhaps most remarkable about the Gestapo's out-of-the-law operations was their creation of entire sites for physical punishment. One famous chamber of Gestapo punishment was found between Brussels and Antwerp in occupied Belgium. What was an old fort had been disguised into a prison camp surrounded by moats, barbed wire fences, and even machine gun posts from towers. There were barracks inside of standard size, housing around 100 prisoners. Yet, there was also a collection of small, stone-floored cells purely for physical punishment. From ethnic and religious minorities to political opponents, Gestapo punishment was a prolonged ordeal of lessening the will and dignity of the prisoner. Once taken to a punishment chamber, prisoners were typically shackled by the wrist and restrained to a nearby wall with a foot-long chain. In between interrogations, a tin bowl of food would be placed on the chamber floor at the full extent of their chain. This was placed inside through a low trap door, and the prisoner was expected to eat from the bowl on the floor like an animal. Typically, the bowl was only left out for minutes. Any prisoner that could not manage the task was left without food. Yet, this was only the beginning of the regular treatment of Gestapo captives. When Allied troops were to discover the Gestapo chambers after the war, they extended the length and breadth of occupied Europe. Soldiers would look upon these cold cells where the bodies of the captives remained naked, often shot and gassed. Yet further examination provided more clues about the ghastly things the Gestapo did to their prisoners. On the ceilings were 2 hooks from which prisoners could be hoisted up and down. Below them was a drain on the stone floor, only there for the letting of blood. On the walls were plugs that had been extended for the use of electrocuting prisoners. Chillingly, outside of the premises of these chambers, there was more evidence of brutality to discover. Across these faux prison camps disguising Gestapo chambers was clear evidence of execution grounds. Many forts were discovered with bullet holes across the ground floor of their wooden walls. Sheds were also discovered full of confiscated belongings from Gestapo prisoners. As for the moats, it would later be revealed that prisoners themselves would be made to dig them, only for Gestapo guards to kick them into the water or sinking sands. Many Gestapo prisoners would succumb to pneumonia and die. Norway would be another location of Gestapo brutality across occupied Europe. The National Archive, Akrivet, was taken over by the Gestapo to make a headquarters. Here it was revealed that, for grim interrogation methods, the commander of the local Gestapo would need to be informed. Yet, as it may not surprise, if the commander could not be informed in due time, any given Gestapo officer could make the call. Here at Arkivet, accounts of beatings that included purposeful blows to vital organs were implemented to induce physical injuries. Whips and blunt objects were also used for this brutality. Some Gestapo prisoners would speak of slower, more purposeful punishment, being made to stand with both hands over their heads for hours at a time. In Norway and likely elsewhere across Europe, the Gestapo made up methods of physical punishment as they went. They would use whatever implements were available. At Arkivet, they used archiving rods to bind and raise victims aloft by their hands and legs for physical beatings. What ultimately made the Gestapo so terrifying to the population it surveilled was the extent of empowerment Nazi Germany gave it. The agents had the power to decide the very fates of the people they brought under arrest. A Gestapo agent could choose leniency, handing out dismissals of cases, or only issuing a fine or warning. Yet this was a self-governing arm of Nazi machinery. People could be detained indefinitely, or, as would be the fate of so many, people could be sent to concentration camps. The Gestapo was a grim instrument of the Nazi persecution of the Jewish population of Europe. Under a remit known as the Schutzhaft, the Gestapo could entirely bypass the court system. Roughly translated to protective custody, Schutzhaft meant Gestapo agents could send people directly to concentration camps. Placed in protective custody, this individual had no court or lawyer as means to defend themselves. Perhaps more frighteningly, the Gestapo could actually override court decisions. The Gestapo would have the final word with no exception, except maybe that of Hitler himself. Between their joining the Einsatzgruppen's mass shooting, protective custody, and the orchestrating of deportations, there was perhaps no greater threat to the Jewish people of Europe than the Gestapo. Come the end of World War II, the Gestapo was recognized for what it was: a terror on the population of occupied Europe and an avid precipitating factor of the Holocaust. The Allied forces would disband the evil mechanism of the Third Reich and bring many of its command and agents to the stand at the Nuremberg trials. 22 major war criminals were brought to justice. 19 of the 22 were convicted, with 12 being sentenced to death. The Gestapo had been officially denounced as a criminal organization. On the other side of justice, however, its leader Heinrich Müller disappeared at the end of the war and was never tried. To this day, the Gestapo remains a dark symbol of state repression and surveillance from the disturbing history of the Third Reich. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.